Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. Joffrey Noodle Legs here today with a bit of a different one for you. As it's Father's Day today, it's just got me thinking back at me life a little bit. Just before I was a dad. I mean, I've been a dad now for 30 years, and before then, in my sort of youth, my biggest thing was music and going to concerts and seeing all these amazing bands. So I've been thinking back over the 80s and thinking about some of the amazing bands I've seen over the time in the 80s. I've seen loads of bands in the 90s and onwards, 2000s, but the 80s was my sort of my time when I started to really get into music and go to concerts. In the 70s, I went to a few concerts at the end of the 70s, but I was only in sort of like 10, 11, 12 around that time. So it was when I was sort of 13, 14, 15, 16 when I really got into bands. So I've got a top five of favourite bands that I saw live. Now, in the 1980s. Now, these I think were the best performing bands of the 1980s top five. But before I get to those, I'll go through some of the bands that I've seen, because the 80s was sort of like a sort of game of two halves for me. The first part of the 80s, I'd say from about 79 to about 83, it was really dominated by the sort of electronic music sort of scene. And I was absolutely into that big time. And then after them, that seemed to have fizzled out, because a lot of the bands around that sort of time that I loved split up and went their own separate ways. Um, and we'll get onto that in a minute. So, and in the second half of the 80s, I got into more sort of heavier and sort of rockier sort of scene, and with the sort of gothic sort of music scene and stuff like that, and the alternative music scene. So it was a sort of it was two halves, but both of them were incredible, absolutely incredible. I mean, so the first part of the 80s, I went to see so many cool bands. I'm trying not to mention the top five until I get to them. But yeah, I mean, one of my friends, me and my friend John Murrell, we went to see Depeche Mode in 1982. And it was the first time I went to a concert with a friend, really. And we went to see them at the Hammersmith Odeon on the Broken Frame tour, and that was absolutely amazing. I've been to concerts before them, but this was the first time I went to one with a friend. So it's really cool. The other times I went before then, it was because when I was really young, I used to work in a social club in Bragby End, and I met a guy there called Gary, who was a friend. Still in touch with him, um, Gary and Dean, and I used to go to concerts with them because I was still quite young. And sort of like my parents trusted him. They used to let me go to concerts with him because we had the same sort of music taste. But yeah, I went to see Depeche Mode, and they were absolutely fantastic. And then when I was working at Bragby End, I had a friend, not a girlfriend, but a female friend called Liz, and we went to see a couple of bands in Dunstable, Queensway. We went to see China Crisis, and that they were really good. They were a little bit more sort of mainstream poppy to what I preferred the more darker electronic stuff. But yeah, I went to see them with her, and they were fantastic. We had a great time. We had such a good time that we went a few months later to see another band there called Blancmange, and they were really good as well. Such a great band, such a cool band. And we used to just go and see all these sort of bands. Me and my friend Gary went to see one of my favourite top fives quite a bit, so I'm not going to mention them yet. So it's quite difficult to go through this without dropping in the names of my top five. But yeah, the early 80s was full of sort of bands like that I went to see. Depeche Mode, China Crisis, and Blancmange, and all these sort of sort of new romantic bands, I suppose. But yeah, they were really cool. And then as I got a little bit older, I used to go to our local social club called Bowes Line House. And and I made some friends there, and they were all they were into the electronic scene like me, the dark side of it, the darker sort of dark sort of synth sort of music, and then they also liked more alternative bands. So I went to get I managed to go and see quite a few sort of like really alternative bands. We went to see Soft Cell at their farewell concert in 1983. I want to say 83. It could have been 82. It was the Art of Falling Apart tour, I believe, or Last Night in Sodom. It was one of the two. We went to the last concerts at the Hammersmith Palais, and that was absolutely fantastic. And we went as a group because this was a social club, and we all sort of chipped in, and it paid for our tickets and the minibus sort of petrol, and we went to see a few bands. We went to see I say Soft Cell. We went to see Mark Almond and the Willing Sinners. That was his sort of first sort of solo band when his Soft Cell split up. So we went to see all these crazy, crazy bands. And I met one of my dear friends there called Kevin. And we got into become really close friends in the 80s. And Kevin was cool because he drove. And, I didn't drive. So I had the cool friend with the car. So we used to go and see all these bands. We went to see the Cramps down at the Astoria, and they were absolutely incredible. They were like, to us, they were like the band. They were like the 70s people like Led Zeppelin. That was their big band. To us, it was the Cramps, and we went to see the Cramps, and they were fantastic, absolutely amazing band. And we went to see. Who else did we go and see? We saw some amazing bands, me and Kevin. Alien Sex Fiend, which was like a sort of goth sort of band, sort of electronic-y sort of goth band with sort of punk overtones. They're a really good band with sort of quite funny lyrics, and they were quite big at the time. We went to see Alien Sex Fiend at the Astoria and places like that. And it was absolutely fantastic time, the 80s, for live concerts. And the list just went on and on and on. All these bands I went to see: Jesus and Mary Chain, and the Mighty Lemon Drops, who I think were a totally underrated band of sort of like this sort of period. They never got sort of like the love that I think that was deserved. Yeah, the Mighty Lemon Drops were really cool. Really good band. I went to see them. Can't remember the venues now. The Dominion Theatre, I think it was. I went to see them. They were absolutely brilliant. And so the 80s sort of went through all these amazing bands, and I was so lucky. I think I hit my teens. If for a music fan, I think I hit my teens just at the right time. To be honest, because I think all the best bands were coming out that time, and there was just so many great bands that we managed to go and see all over the place. Because I said I was with my friend Kevin, and he drove, and we used to go all over the place to see bands, mostly in London, to different sort of venues and stuff. But we were so lucky to get and see such cool music, and that's sort of what's got me into music today. I think was being lucky enough to actually see all these incredible musicians, like the Cramps and all the stuff that are legends now. And you look back and think, oh my God, you've seen it. People say to me, you've seen the Cramps. I mean, yeah, I've seen the Cramps quite a few times. And all these sort of bands that we used to go and see together. The Sisters of Mercy, the original Sisters of Mercy, before they split up and he got the female woman into the band. Before it was, I can't remember all of the members now. No, there was Wayne Hussey and Craig Adams was in the band with Andrew. Yeah, the Sisters of Mercy were a band we used to go and see a fair bit too. Because they were like, the local band from our town was the Fields of Nephilim, and so we got quite friendly with them, and sort of become friends with the band, and we got to see all the sort of bands they used to play with, and the Sisters of Mercy were a real standout then. They were really good. I lost interest in them when they sort of broke up, because the other members went on to form another band called The Mission, but before then they were in the Sisters of Mercy, and they were absolutely fantastic, really really cool. And me and my friend also went to see quite a few sort of rockabilly bands and stuff at the a venue in London called the Clubfoot. We used to go down there quite a bit to see all these, and we've seen some really bizarre bands as well. Lords of the New Church, the Fuzztones, all these really crazy sort of bands that were about at the time, but were really great. But my diehard at those times were, I loved to go and see those, but we're going to get onto the top five now. I think they were the best bands to see live in the 1980s, and these are in order. Now, not saying these are now, my favourite band is in this list, but they're not number one as favourite live band, because when I say the best live performance, I mean live performance, the atmosphere, the lighting, the sound, all that together creates the concert, right? Doesn't necessarily mean number one is the best live artist, but it is all round the best, I think. So number five is The Cure. They're one of my top bands, as you well know. I've got loads of tattoos. I went through the period when I actually did the Robert Smith hair and everything, because I was a huge fan of The Cure, and I've followed them around quite a bit since like 1980, sort of five upwards. I went to every tour, to about 4 or 5 shows to every tour when they used to play. In London, all over the place. I've seen them at festivals, at Glastonbury. I went to Europe to see them. I was absolutely huge Cure fan, but they're at number five because although they're a fantastic live band, they didn't have absolutely everything. You know, the sort of charisma, the the lighting, the atmosphere, and the performance as well as the sound. You've got to have all those to be the best, I think. And the fifth was The Cure. Number four is a band that I wouldn't say they're similar, but the fans do quite like them, and that's Echo and the Bunnymen. Now, Ian McCulloch has got such a stage presence. He's so cool. He was absolutely, and I loved going and seeing the Bunnymen because their show had a real sort of atmosphere about it, because they used to have lots and lots of dried ice and like really backlit bright lights shining through it, and the beginning of the show always started off with like a sort of Gregorian sort of chant sort of music, and it was like it used to send you shivers every time I used to hear that when the lights would go down. And that's what I remember a lot about the Bunnymen, and that their sound was incredible live. They made some amazing albums, but I think live is where they're at their strong point. Ian McCulloch has got such a great voice, and I think they are underrated as a live band. And they were in the 80s. They were with the original sort of lineup with Les, Pete, and Will and Ian. They were absolutely phenomenal live. Really, really cool. I've seen them so many times at Kilburn, the Royal Albert Hall, um, Hammersmith Palais, all over London. I went to see them because I just loved them so much. Such a great live band. And I used to collect tapes, bootleg tapes of their shows and stuff. I used to go to record fairs and buy the bootleg tapes, and I specifically used to look for the Bunnymen ones, just because they were always good quality, because their sound was always great. So they're my four favourite live acts from the 1980s. Number three is here's a difficult one. Yeah, number three, I was going to say Japan, but I'm going to put them down in the honourable mention list simply because I only saw them the once. Because they broke up in '82, and I saw them in '82 at Hammersmith Odeon, and it's the only time they were fantastic, and I came out there and I was absolutely. I went through the post gig blues the day after. I saw them because they were amazing, but I only saw them the once, so I can only put them in the honourable mention. So number 3 is going to go to Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark. So OMD, they were an absolute amazing live band in the 80s. I saw them in Architectural Morality tour. I saw them in the Dazzle Ship tour. I saw them on the Junk Culture tour, and these were like 3 years in a row, and they were absolutely amazing shows, full of atmosphere, and their songs have such this dark sort of synth sound to it that is haunting. And the light show and Andy McCluskey's voice just sort of, it just sends shivers down your spine. So it brings something really special and memorable to that show. And all their shows were absolutely brilliant. Such a great live band, and they're still going today, and they're still putting out some amazing live shows today. So number 2, my favourite, I think, of the best, second favourite live performers of the 80s is my favourite band, and that's New Model Army. Now, I saw New Model Army at Stevenage. They played Bowes-Lyon House on a Sunday night in 1984, and it's the first time I saw them, and they just blew me away just by their songwriting, their sort of ferocious sort of performance of their songs. They were so raw. They'd only released 2 albums at this point, Vengeance and No Rest, and they were just so raw, but it was a real sort of goth undertone to it. They weren't gothic, but they had that sort of undertone going through the sort of bass line, which was very similar to another band that I saw at Stevenage at that time that I loved, called Play Dead. They were another fantastic live band. Not around anymore, sadly. They don't play anymore. But yeah, New Model Army had this sort of bass sound that they had, and they had the same sort of sounds of like Killing Joke, but they were sort of more rawer, and they sang about things that I believed in, about the way humans are sort of dominating the planet, and not in a good way, and all this sort of thing. So I could really relate to their songs, and that was it. And since I went to that show, I've been to every tour, and that since, apart from the last 2, because of my health. But since then, I went to every tour, and over time, I've become friends with the band and know them really well, and they are my favourite band. But they're number 2 for, I think, the best live performers of the 1980s. Now, I would say they're number 1 for the best performers, because they're still going, and their shows are still fantastic, and they still have that energy, and they haven't lost anything whatsoever. In fact, they've actually matured and become even better. So they're, I think, number 1 now, the best live band in Britain. But the best live band, I think, of the 1980s has to go to Gary Numan. I think because he was like nothing you've ever seen. He put on a show. He put on the stage sets. He put on the light sets. He put on the atmosphere with the dried ice and the dark, droning underbelly, dark synth sound. And he had that stage presence of like almost aliens. Like, wow, he's a super god, because he just sort of, he wasn't like, are you ready to rock? He wasn't like none of that. He was just cold, quiet, sung the songs and didn't speak very much. And I just thought, man, you're cool as fuck. I just thought, you're the coolest mofo out there. And he was. And he produced some of the best albums in the early 80s and late 70s. And to see them perform live, and he was absolutely fantastic on stage, real stage presence. He's still performing today. He's still recording today. He's a little bit heavier now. He's gone down the more sort of like industrial sort of sound of his influences from Nine Inch Nails, which is quite a strange story because Nine Inch Nails say that Gary Numan influenced them, and now they're sort of influencing Gary Numan. So it's sort of how it's come around. That's quite cool. But yeah, in the 1980s, I think nobody beat Gary Numan when it came to live shows. It was an event. It was an event. The days before the concerts, you were just sort of like, oh God, watching the time, watching the clock. Why can't it be this day? Why can't it be this day? And I used to go with my friend Gary, like I said, from my social club, and I used to go with him. And I've seen him at Hammersmith Odeon. I've seen him at Wembley Arena and things like this. And it was just like, I can't wait to go and see Gary Numan. And when the shows were over, I had the blues every day. I bought all the merchandise, the t-shirts, scarves, badges, programs. I think I've done a video on some of that and shown you some of the programs already. Because I've met Gary a few times since, and he signed all these stuff for me. But yeah, but back in that day, there was no one like him. He stole the concert scene in the 1980s, I think. I think no one bettered him. Yes, all these big bands were still playing, you know, Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, all these artists were still touring. But it was Gary Numan, to me, that was I think, the best live performer of the 1980s. You know, just because of everything rolled up. The atmosphere, the set, the music, the set, the back screen, everything about everything he did was just phenomenal. And he had such a stage presence. You were in awe. You could not take your eyes off him. He's like that when you watch him. He's like, oh my God, I'm here, and Gary Numan's there, you know. And you ended up idolizing the guy, you know. Unfortunately, he sort of brought that to an end in 1981. I mean, because I saw him in 1980 and in 81, he did his farewell concerts at Wembley, which I went to. And he just ended it all because of all the stress that he was getting from the press. He retired, you know, and he retired from touring. But 1983, 2 years later, he came back on tour, the Warriors tour, and that was fantastic. It was just fantastic to see him back. And that was one of the highlight moments of the 1980s for me, was Gary Numan's Warriors tour. I loved the farewell concerts. I loved the Telecon tour. But because we thought that was it, it's the last show, when he came back with Warriors tour, it blew me away. Absolutely fantastic. And in the following year, we had the Berserker tour, then we had the Fury tour, and you know, I mean, he did tour after tour. But that part, I think, the 80s live belongs to Gary Numan. Very closely followed by New Model Army. New Model Army, because they were merciless, and they still are. They were merciless. They would play show after show after show after show. Go to Europe, come back, play show after show after show. Do the festivals, then show. They were merciless. They were always on tour. They were like non-stop touring all the time. So it was difficult to go to all the shows, but I went to as many as I could. But you know, it's just fantastic. But Gary's were events, and it was always around normally October. October was always the Gary Numan tour. So to me, it was like, because I was still quite young, it was like, oh, come the latter part of the year, it was the greatest part of the year for me because I had my birthday in October. Then Gary Numan would do a tour. He would release an album like in September, and then he would do a tour in October, and then we would have Christmas coming up. And so it was the best part of the year for me when at that time. Yeah, but I was absolutely so lucky to be around in the 80s to see all these bands, you know, and so many bands like Japan, the Cramps, Tom Waits, and things like this, things that I've seen, and people think you're so lucky to have seen these big bands and stuff, and I am Really, really lucky. And I saw Bob Dylan. I saw Bob Dylan at Wembley Stadium with he was with the Grateful Dead, and he was fantastic. And I saw Bob. We went to Europe, and this is how cool Bob Dylan is. Okay, we went to this festival in Europe, and it was Bob Dylan was headliner, then The Cure, and it was like Sinead O'Connor, INXS, and other bands like that. And Bob Dylan was so cool because it was time, I think, of either the World Cup or European Football Championships, and Robert Smith loves his football. So Bob Dylan swapped his position on the bill so The Cure could go the headline and Bob Dylan went underneath so they could watch the football. How cool is that? You know, little things like that when you hear these stories, because Robert Smith said it over the channel. You know, thanks to Bob, we managed to watch the football. I think England lost the match, but you know what I mean. But it was so cool that he does things like that. You know, and this is Bob Dylan. And I was just thinking, yeah, man, you're cool. You're right up there. But I didn't get into a lot of those bands, Bob Dylan and Neil Young and stuff, till a bit later in my life, because I think as you get older, your music taste matures and it widens, and it sort of like grows with you. But you never forget those days where it all began. And to me, it was with Gary Newman, OMD, Soft Cell, Depeche Mode, you know, Blancmange, China Crisis, Japan, all these bands I was so lucky to see live. And then I progressed to the more heavier with the New Model Army, Alien, Sex Fiends, Sisters of Mercy, the Cramps, you know, the Cult, all these amazing bands that I was so lucky to see. And in the 90s come along, and I was lucky to go and see bands like Nine Inch Nails and all these incredible bands that came out in the 90s, the Revolting Cocks, the Ministry, all these sort of like industrial bands that came out, the Wonder Stuff, all these incredible bands that were in the 80s, the Mission, All About Eve, all great, and the Cure. Still saw the Cure in the 80s. Still saw Gary Newman in the 80s, New Model Army. So I still followed them through, and I followed them through pretty much all my life. The last time I saw the Cure was about 3 or 4 years ago. I know they're out on tour at the moment, but they're too expensive for me. It's like Nick Cave. We went to see Nick Cave, and now his tickets are just like so expensive, can't afford them. New Model Army play, and their tickets are still like £20 odd, and it's like that's so cool. But unfortunately, because of my health, I can't get to see them anymore. I think my concert days are over. I'm sad to say, but they were the greatest days of my life. In a sense, apart from being a dad. They were the greatest days of my life, going to see all these incredible bands. I was so lucky to see some of the most talented singers in the world. I still think Mark Coleman's got the best live voice I've ever seen, followed probably by David Sylvian. But yeah, you know what I mean. It's and Anthony from Anthony and Johnson's. These such amazing singers. Sucker Ross, all these great bands. I've been so lucky to see them all, but it all started back in those 80s. Thanks for watching, guys.